Good morning and welcome to the Morning Scoop for Saturday, January 22nd. This is your daily Buckeye fix. I'm Tom Orr. The Notre Dame game is in 224 days. The game against Michigan in 309 days. The countdown to the college football playoff expansion, that's a little less clear. Last year, the folks in charge leaked a plan for a 12-team playoff. Everyone assumed, if it's leaking, it must be close to done. And then that has definitely proven not to be the case. So what is happening with the playoff, and maybe more important, what should happen with the playoff? My guest today is Marcus Hartman of the Dayton Daily News. He definitely has some thoughts on both of those questions. So, Marcus, thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me on.
So, I guess I probably shouldn't be surprised that the folks in charge of college football are botching something that, the way that they are screwing up the playoff conversation. But it sure sounds like pretty much everything about the new playoff, including the number of teams, when it might start, who should get in. It sounds like all that stuff is still kind of just very much up in the air at this point.
Yeah, well, it seems like a few different things are going on. When they announced this 12-team plan, and it even caught it literally caught everyone by surprise, because even like Pete Thamel and Dan Wetzel, who were like the two most connected guys, especially with postseason stuff, they on their podcast like a couple of days later, they were like, they didn't know it was happening until they got to the last paragraph of that press release that they slipped it into. And so I know a lot of people were like really transfixed by the creativeness of the 12-team playoff. But my immediate thought was, well, it's kind of interesting, but like it's not practical at all. You can't do it as the 12. You cannot do this based on without making compromises that they are not willing to make. So like 12, it literally will not fit into the calendar the way that it is now. They set it up. I always thought when they came up with the 4, that was a compromise that they were always going to go to 8, because 4 doesn't work with 5 power conferences, let alone Notre Dame. It just doesn't work. It's just a math problem. I mean, and honestly, it's worked better than it should, because there have been so many years that at least one of the leagues had no legitimate claim to being in it, which is half of a fluke. Even when they set it up and they made the semifinals still January 1st, that was kind of stupid, I thought. But that means that they left December wide open to tack one more game on there in the middle of December without really ruining everything. Well, they can't add 2 weeks worth of games. And we heard that you can't have second semester football. Okay, well, we have second semester football by a week, right? Well, now they're going to add another week. No, that's not going to happen. So I don't think that in and of itself will happen. But if you want it to happen, what you need to do, it's without question, you have to start the season a week earlier, which I think can happen. Like that wouldn't be a big lift. I think they should do that anyway and give everybody a second week off during the season. Because especially now, it's a year-round sport now, and the best time is when they're playing games. So the best time for everybody. It's the best time for fans. It's the best time for the players. It's the best time for the TV networks. So the period of time that games are occurring should be larger. And that also gives guys more time to rest. And theoretically, maybe it reduces some injuries and stuff like that, even during the year. And the other thing they should do is get rid of the conference championship games, which they're also not going to do, even though really they could, because they're going to make so much money off of the playoff that they'll come out way ahead. And the money that they lose off of it's hilarious to think about when the Big Ten went to their championship game. I think it was like they were going to get $20 million from Fox just for that. So it was like a one-time. Now, okay, from now on we're getting another $20 million a year. Okay. And that was like increasing their TV payroll by like 10% or something. Well, now that 20 million is not even that. Now it's like, it'd be less than 5%. So it's not even that much money in the grand scheme of things, hilariously enough. So they should get rid of the conference championship games, and then you'd have a schedule where this would kind of work. And it would make sense to have those games there, those semifinal games around then. Well, they're not going to do any of those things. So like it makes sense that like it just logistically doesn't work. But then on top of that, you have where they screwed everything up with Texas, kneecapping the Big 12, made people mad. It also kind of threw off that there should be no AQ automatic qualifier. There should be no such thing as an AQ, because there's no longer going to be an AQ conference in and of itself that could possibly consistently have good teams. Like you're not Cincinnati and Houston and BYU and UCF. Those are pretty much the only teams that are going to be good like regularly. They're now in a power conference. So there's no need for an automatic AQ bid either. So I do like that top 6 regardless of who the conference is. I do like that. So because that allows when there's a team that clearly deserves to be in, like Cincinnati, then they can get in. It doesn't guarantee that if, the ACC champion is not even ranked, or even, more likely they're like 20th or whatever, or the Pac-12, they shouldn't get in if that's what they're ranked. I don't think anybody, literally no one, would disagree with that except for the ACC champion, apparently, and apparently Kevin Warren. So that was the one good thing about it. Because again, and I'll go off my tangent and we can start over again after that. But the other thing about it was, and I did see even like somebody smart, like Andy Staples, said like, oh, well, the point of this 12-team playoff is this first, because somebody was like, well, that first round of games is really unnecessary for picking the national champion, which is completely correct. He goes, oh, but it's just more fun games. And I said, okay, well, that was never the point of, that's like the complete antithesis of the whole discussion we've been having for 50 years about playoffs, is that the fun games are supposed to be in the regular season. So I want more fun games, but they don't need to be playoff games. You can also just kind of make things to where those fun games should just be your traditional rivalry games that are determining conference championships at the end of the regular season.
Yeah. That's you touched on a lot of stuff there. One thing I wanted to circle back on was Big Ten Commissioner Kevin Warren, always a favorite of Ohio State fans. According to the reporting from these meetings, he is not going to sign on unless all 5 power conference champs are guaranteed a spot in the field. To me, that seemed like a really weird hill to die on, because, I mean, go back through the last decade of Big Ten football. When was the last time the Big Ten champion would not have made even an 8-team playoff? Probably 2012, when all that took was Ohio State being on a bowl ban and Penn State having a once-in-a-lifetime scandal, and a third-place Wisconsin team making the Big Ten championship game and then blowing out Nebraska. I mean,
Nebraska. I don't even remember what Nebraska was ranked, but if Nebraska had just won that game, they may have been. Yeah, I'm sure they were ranked. I don't remember what they were ranked, but I think they had 2 losses because prior to that game. So they were ranked somewhere. They weren't in the top 5 or anything like that. But yeah, I mean, obviously, and that's just a complete fluke for a variety of reasons. But yeah, I don't get it, because especially if you're saying you need the top 5, the power conferences should be guaranteed a spot. And it's just as an alternative to there being 6 guarantees. Now, if it was the alternative was like no guarantees, I go, okay, well, I don't agree, but at least I see where you're coming from. But like, there's functionally no reason to insist on the top 5, because unless something incredibly strange that never happens, you're going to be in the top 6. So who cares? Like, what's the top 6 thing is way better functionally, and it's way better for PR, which is the only thing that really matters here. So take the win as a PR matter, and then you can get these teams in, and then you can, because I don't really think, I am not a bleeding heart for the little guy in college football. I mean, if UC had gotten left out because there were 4, it was a typical year, I wouldn't have felt bad. I mean, it would suck for UC, but it wouldn't have been this great injustice. It just would have been, that's life. You know what I mean? They got in, they clearly deserved to be in, but it helped because they coincidentally beat Notre Dame, and and you had the Pac-12 and the ACC fell apart, and the Big 12 fell, so there was no debate about them getting in. I mean, they needed like 4 things to happen. They needed 3 things to happen and got 4. And so, but if they had been left out, I mean, in a 4-team playoff, I'm okay with that. But if you're going to go with this top 6, if you're going to go, I think 8 is a better number. And I think then that still leaves room for the regular season to matter. It still leaves room for you to make the conference championships matter. And if, I think, but the only problem is, it is nice to have more than 1 at large, and you may not have more than 1. You may only have 2 at larges, especially depending on what Notre Dame's doing. But you've got to have auto bids, because the auto bid is the mechanism for making the conference championships matter. Yeah. And so, which is again why you need to have that top 6 qualification in this 12-team playoff was a good idea, because it didn't lock in a crappy conference. But it also, I don't think we should, I guess my point was, I wouldn't lock in a Q5, a non-power conference team either, because there are certainly going to be years they don't deserve to be in, but they're also pretty much always going to be in the top 12. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of it's one of these things that's not even barely worth arguing about. Like, the top 6 is a good idea. It makes sense. And I don't know why that's what they're stuck on. because like the other thing is the reason that I said, so Kevin Warren continues to not really seem to understand anything from a political standpoint or from like a common sense standpoint, because his position doesn't make any sense for a variety of reasons. But then you go back to the guy who it's interesting to see him pick the wrong hill to die on, because the guy that should be the Big Ten commissioner is Jim Phillips, who is apparently the only guy who's been sane in the room for the whole team. And now he's the ACC commissioner. And he's the one that has come out and said, well, that he is against a lot of this for a period of time because it's too many games. The players and the ACC, apparently there have been multiple coaches that have talked to their players. The ACC, they don't want to play more games. This is something that's gotten like zero talk, which is amazing, because that's normally that kind of thing is like something that gets run into the ground, like health and safety gets run into the ground. Like every other discussion about football, college football, that's all people talk about, has been completely ignored in this factor. And I really think that if you're looking at a 17, nobody's going to play 12 games and then quit in December. But I think if you're looking at a 17 game season, more juniors would opt out before the season. Like LSU and Ohio State and Alabama juniors might go, that's too much for me. 17 games, I'll play 12 or 13 or 14 games. 17, that's too much. And I think not saying that a dozen guys would do it, but I think that's where the line is broken. Because the other thing is two things. Urban, I remember came in after the 14 championship game, and he was like blown away by how beat up they were. And that was the first time he'd seen a team play 15 games. And so, I know obviously Urban is prone to hyperbole, but he's also like, it's partly because he's kind of sometimes just turns the filter off. There's not much of a damper. It's either completely on or off. So he was like blown away by how beat up they were. So there's no way they could have played another game after that. And I took that all to be 100% true. Then you take that onto that. And, a couple of years ago, I was at the NFL Combine and Joe Burrow didn't throw. And he basically said, yeah, well, we're all still too beat up from the championship game because it was just like a few weeks ago. So that's another reason you cannot play the championship game any later than it is now. It's probably already too late in the year. You definitely cannot move it back from a practical standpoint because it messes up. But aside from Joe Burrow, all these guys that actually might want to go to the Senior Bowl, because there have been multiple guys over the past few years that couldn't play in the Senior Bowl because they were hurt or just beat up from even little if you just have a month off to rest. There's guys who are too hurt or beat up to play in the Senior Bowl. That can be a big deal for a lot of guys. Really anybody who's going to the Senior Bowl, they probably really need to look good there. There's a reason that they're going. It's because they need to improve their stock somehow or another. So that's another reason that I find this whole thing to be just completely unrealistic. And it's amazing that only one person has brought up these concerns in all of this, and it's Jim Phillips.
Yeah, it's interesting to me that you heard when they were talking about expanding the NFL season from 16 games to 17, like that extra week, that was a huge talking point of player safety and CTE and all that stuff. And then it's just, college football players don't have quite the agency. Well, they're getting more than they used to, but they still don't have the agency, of the NFL Players Union or anything like that. Yeah,
when people were asking the Ohio State guys about it in July at Big Ten Media Days, and the impression that I got, they all said, yeah, I would do it. But they also basically said, I do it because I have to. It wouldn't be my favorite thing, but okay, let's do it. And even Gene Smith, I thought, was a little bit resigned. He basically said, well, if they play another game, that's not a big deal, as long as we cut back practice time, which there's some validity to that. A little bit at least. It's not completely invalid. But again, the other thing about it is, again, so are you going to get rid of I don't think there's any debate really that 17 games is too many. Nobody who's being honest is going to disagree with that. But lots of people are dishonest these days. But I think when we're being honest, I think that's too many games. 15 is about the number. So 16 is what they play at the other divisions, unless I believe, I'm pretty sure that in the FCS, if you play in the first round and then go to the championship, you will play 17 games, I think. Or I think you'd play 16 games. But typically that doesn't happen because you get a bye. And then so the champion of the FCS plays 16 games. So now we're talking about maybe playing 17. And again, they write this off and say, oh, well, some of the teams will get a bye, and go, okay, well, they're not all going to. So I don't think you can just easily write that stuff off as if, oh, it's just not going to happen. So I think that's really the other thing. But the other thing you could do, you could get rid of the worthless conference championship games, or you could just get rid of the 12th regular season game, which basically everyone agrees is completely a waste of time. to begin with, and has ever since. When they added the 12th regular season game was because they had way fewer revenue sources in like 2005. It was basically an accident because there was an extra Saturday in the season, so everybody got to play 12 games in like 2003 or 4 or whenever it was, and so they got addicted to that extra revenue. Well, again, their revenue is literally like 8 times larger than it was in 2005. So even whatever extra money you get from the 12th game is really not even that big of a factor. And on the other end, you've got fans like nonstop complaining about how they hate the worst game on the schedule. Like it's like the worst thing that ever happened to them. So it's like, we'll just get rid of the 12th game. And they're not going to do that either, even though there's a good case that could be made for it. So I think the bottom line is the leadership on this is all just so bad that this is why they're stuck. Because A, they put out a proposal that they couldn't even see all the flaws in, and B, they don't have the leadership or the courage to actually, they don't have the courage to ram it through, for one thing, which is actually kind of surprising. But then they also don't have the courage to make these obvious and easy changes that they could make that would be totally worthwhile. And honestly, they should probably make anyway.
Yeah. And, you consider the change in revenue streams and the importance of tickets versus TV revenue to a school. I mean, to pretty much any school. Ohio State might be one of the rare exceptions where Ohio State's making $6 million or whatever per home game. But for most schools, like the TV revenue far outstrips the game revenue for Northwestern or Indiana or Purdue or places like that. So yeah,
they used to make like $20 million a year, and like more than half of it was ticket revenue.
Yeah.
Now they make like $200 million, and the ticket revenue is still pretty much the same.
Yeah. Yeah. You push back, add an extra week at the beginning of the season, take one of those games out, then you're playing 11 games spread out with a couple extra weeks off in the middle. That maybe mitigates some of those concerns about the health and safety end of things, which, we are all supposed to pretend to care about this stuff. That is actually something that you're supposed to, everyone says they care about it. And then,
I find the health and
money.
I think I find health and safety important. I just think a lot of the people that are complaining about that are worrying about that, actually their worries are either bogus or their expectation of health is not realistic compared to what the average, like the football players know that you're going to get beat up and all that stuff. And there's some people that think that, no one should ever get hurt or be sore or anything like that. So, but I do think it helps to have a little extra time off here and there. I mean, and I think they probably cut back preseason practice too much. I think there's a balance there, and so they maybe cut that stuff down, and some of the practice contact they've cut back too much. But not that I think that we should still be having 3-a-days and having people just wail on each other for like 20 straight days in August and stuff like that. But sometimes I think they've cut it back too much from that standpoint, which is again why I find it hilarious that like we've been doing all this stuff for all this time, and then we're saying, "Oh yeah, well let's just play a couple more games. No big deal. Let's just forget about it." So it's amazing to watch how these things shake out these days.
So, from your perspective, what is the ideal playoff format? When does the playoff start? How many teams are in? Are they playing it at bowl games? How many teams get automatic bids? Like what if you were appointed college football commissioner tomorrow? You are the governor of Fansville. What does the college football playoff look like?
Well, I think there's two options. Assuming that you want to keep at least most of the bowls, then an 8-team playoff is enough, and it fits fairly well. I would still move the schedule. I would still move the whole season up a week, and honestly, that even if that includes playing championships on Thanksgiving weekend instead, I would do that. Or one way or another, I think it makes way too much sense to just go ahead and start the season a week earlier, and then use that week however you see fit. I think I would do the way things are now. I would do 8 teams, and again, I think you need to make all the conference championships meaningful. So let's say 6 spots for conference champions. But then that allows when you have another super team, which inevitably there's usually one really, really good non-championship team. Plus you need to make room for Notre Dame or Cincinnati or whoever. And so I would probably do 6 automatic bids for, and who knows, maybe it would work out if you just said 4 automatic bids for the top 4 conference champions, because that would still make the conference championship important for everybody. Everybody who's in the make. You'd still be wanting to finish out that 12-0 regular season to lock in your bid rather than just be like almost literally like musical chairs where your spot could just disappear even if you slip up. I would do an 8-team playoff. I'm not one of these like people who's really obsessed with the home sites, but it makes sense to have home sites for that first week. And this is, again, maybe if you move it up and you have it a little earlier, maybe the cold is less of a concern. I would do home sites. And then if you need to, the easiest thing would be just go into, that first round just leads you into the way the semifinal and everything is set up now. The other thing is, and I don't understand how a lot of the bowls stay in business. I know there's a lot of people that just like there's all the money is fake and everything like that. But I think if you're going to have all the major players start opting out of most of the bowls, I kind of think I've always said the playoff would grow to 8 and that would be it because they want to keep the bowls in business. Well, if the bowls go out of business, then you'd get a real playoff. And I think, I haven't worked out the math on it, but I would be totally fine with a real playoff of 16 or 24. I think that would be perfectly enjoyable as well if the bowls went out of business. So either one of those I would find acceptable. But I think that the thing that most people would probably agree on would be an 18 playoff that makes the regular season more important, as I would get rid of the conference championship games, go back to determining your champion just by, the team with the best record, and then go from there. And you can still name a champ. There's some people who seem to have forgotten you can still have a legitimate champion without playing a bogus championship game that only actually includes the 2 best teams half the time. The worst possible thing you can do is do what the Big 12 does and just automatically play a rematch, like match your top 2 teams up. That's the stupidest possible setup that you can ever have. And I think there's people that want the Big 10 to do that too, which makes no sense whatsoever. Hopefully whatever happens, that never happens. But I think that would make the most sense. Like I said, even though they could, because the TV contracts aren't that far out, and again, the money in the grand scheme of things is not that much. I think that they could get rid of the conference championship games and move on from there and keep the 12-game regular season, because Gene said, one thing about cutting the 12-game regular season down is, he said this last year, and when we got him for a few minutes on the side in the Big Ten media days, he said, well, the problem with that is not everybody is going to play a 12th game, which makes sense. But again, he also was the guy who said 10 years or more maybe ago that in the grand scheme of things, he could sacrifice a game if he was still going to be made whole by the money, which they would be. I don't think there's any dispute about that whatsoever. Now, maybe he's changed his mind since then. He's allowed to do that. But I also find it interesting that is something he has literally said in the past. So it's been a thought of his, and maybe he can't remember it now. But sometimes I wonder if these guys get so locked in the moment, they forget the different options that they have as well. So it's a long-winded way of saying I would keep things somewhat how they are and do an 18 playoff, because that lets you get every power conference champion in, unless, let's say I think you need to make a minimum ranking for the conference champion, whether it's 10 or 12 or whatever it is. It allows a Cinderella like Cincinnati would be in and Notre Dame to be in, and then it keeps the conference championships important. But I also wouldn't hate it if there was just a regular playoff and the bowls more or less went out of business, which I still, again, I'm not exactly sure how some of these bowls stay in business anyway. Maybe they just get people to work for free to put on the games or something like that. But either one of those I would find acceptable.
Yeah, I think people forget that there used to be, there were 15 bowl games, 18 bowl games. Now there's 43. It's what would we do without the Heart of Dallas Bowl?
Were all on January 1st. It was, 2 things happened. Now we have 4 games on January 1st or whatever.
Yeah.
And so it's 1% of the bowls are on January 1st instead of 90% of them. So they increased the number of total bowls, and they reduced the number of bowls on January 1st, which is a double loss as far as I'm concerned. And because I could do without there being a bowl every night necessarily. I think in the grand scheme of things, you could adjust things to make that to find a better balance with all that stuff too.
So before I let you go, there was another topic I wanted to touch on, because this one has just been fascinating to me: the ongoing saga of Jim Harbaugh. And as of the time we're recording this on Friday afternoon, there is still no word on what he's planning to do. Bruce Feldman from The Athletic said earlier this week that he was hearing from sources that if Harbaugh was offered the job, he would take it. Now, I'm wondering if Harbaugh is kind of in that Brian Kelly camp where, Kelly's at Notre Dame for a million years. And I feel like he sort of saw they had kind of hit the ceiling with his program. And, I wonder if Harbaugh is kind of in that same boat where everything went right this year. They had the level of talent they generally don't. They've got two potential, sounds like top 10 NFL draft picks on the defensive line. That is not something that Michigan has every year. They had all this stuff kind of coalesce. Everything came together nicely for them. And then they were still totally non-competitive in the playoff. And, maybe that's him just kind of going like, okay, like I'm going to go, George Costanza, I'm going to go out on a high note and, leave coming off of a good season. If you're Jim Harbaugh, is he, the other side of it is he just kind of trying to leverage some more money out of Michigan for, a nice big contract to get made whole after taking a big cut last year. So, if you were Jim Harbaugh, what would you do right now? If you have a Raiders job offer in one hand and Michigan, the opportunity to come back to Michigan in the other hand, what would you do?
Well, I think it's easy to, I don't think Jim Harbaugh thinks like most people do, for better or for worse. Some ways better, some ways worse. I think he legitimately does want to be at Michigan. And maybe I could be wrong about that. Maybe in a vacuum, I'm sure he legitimately wants to be at Michigan. Maybe he has already made enough enemies that he doesn't necessarily like. It's not that pleasant there anymore. And maybe he has kind of realized that it's going to be impossible for him to build a national champion there. I tend to think he probably doesn't think that way. I think he thinks he could beat the 72 Dolphins if you gave him enough time, even at Michigan even. So I'm not so sure if that would necessarily be what he thinks. I think it could be as simple as it's another challenge, and he's coached in the NFL before. He almost won the Super Bowl, so that's another. He did accomplish something here, and now he's got, if he's got the Raiders, showing him some love, maybe he's just, what, maybe that could be interesting. I mean, almost as simple as just, a puppy dog just bouncing back and forth from one source of love to another. Because all those things make sense. I definitely think this was a kind of a fluky year where everything fell into place for them in a variety of ways. I think no matter what you think the ceiling is, they're going to be horrible next year. So even if you think that you can get back to that, which is not out of the question, but it's pretty unlikely based on the last 20 years, it's not going to happen next year. They're going to have a pretty rough year next year in all likelihood, unless they have a bunch of freshmen and sophomores who are just unbelievable. And I do think that there's a chance that you look at the way some of those guys were talking after the Ohio State game. They say, well, that really did make our offseason better, and now we understand what it means to have a good offseason and maximize us. And I think there could be something to that. Sometimes I do think that maybe because that's been lacking for a long time there, I think, is the offseason stuff. I think if you are a Michigan team and you actually show up and work hard all offseason and maximize your talent, that's something we haven't really seen Michigan do with any regularity for a long time. So I actually do think that could be a step that that really could be like a jumping off point for the program kind of getting back to being what they think they should be in the long run. Again, they're not going to be good next year, but in the long run, I think that's a very logical thing that could happen. Now, that's easier said than done. But with the Harbaugh thing again, so I get worried about people kind of taking a little bit of information and then again, like I agree with all these logical conclusions that people have made. I'm just not, that's everybody using their own logic or the group logic, which may or may not apply to how Jim Harbaugh thinks about things. It could be a pride thing with the contract stuff too. I tend to think I really believe his default is if all things are equal, he would rather be at Michigan than everywhere else. Maybe I'm naive. I actually think that. And I don't know. I know that's not necessarily how most people think these days about any job, but I think that is how he looks at this job. So I will believe he leaves when I see it. But again, it could be just that, well, what the heck, this was fun. What's another challenge? Or again, maybe he's not getting along with his bosses anymore or whatever else. I could see any reason for him to leave, and I could see wanting a new challenge. And he's going to need, if he's going to try to go somewhere else, so he is getting a little bit older. It's not going to be like an immediate rebuild. He's going to need a few years, you'd think, in the NFL. So you'd think that would have to be sooner than later. And maybe he's like a lot of coaches who, is not necessarily sure he wants to navigate the transfer portal and name, image, likeness, and all that stuff too. And I think there are some coaches, like I sort of get this impression about Ryan Day. I think he thinks some of these changes are necessary or positive, but they're still not necessarily want to deal with them. And so that could be part of it too. My default is I would be surprised if he leaves. I've thought that all along. And honestly, it sounds like the interest is greater than I really believed it was in the first place, but nothing would be too shocking.
All right, and I'm going to let you go on this one. We don't talk a lot of NFL on this podcast, like literally ever, but the Bengals don't win playoff games very often, and you got to cover a Bengals playoff win last weekend down in Cincinnati. They are playing again today, Saturday at 4:30 p.m. Favored, they're Titans, favored by 3.5. So you've got former Ohio State linebacker and assistant coach Mike Vrabel going against former Ohio State quarterback Joe Burrow. Can the Bengals reach the AFC Championship for the first time since 1988 and just the third time in franchise history? What are you expecting?
Well, they're playing the number one seed. They're kind of banged up on defense, although they're in better shape than they look like they might be on Monday. There's a lot of unknowns as far as that goes. But I think when you've got Joe Burrow and you've got legitimate weapons, they could beat anybody. They've already beaten the Chiefs, and they basically had the Packers beaten and let them off the hook. So I think they could beat anybody. As hard as it is to believe from this time in like August, they really could beat just about anybody they play. So stranger things have happened. Who knows? I think that Tennessee is also a little bit weird because they throttled Buffalo and they throttled KC early in the year, and then Derrick Henry got hurt. But they've still managed to be the number one seed. So it's a little bit hard to figure this one out. I think that if Derrick Henry is close enough to being himself, I think that you can see where the formula is pretty good for Tennessee to lean on them and just get some big plays and force the Bengals to, what are the Bengals going to do? Because people want the Bengals to throw 45 times a game because that's how they're the best. But they know they can't do that because there's only so many dropbacks you get before your offensive line collapses. So they were striking this balance last week as well, where you've got to just pick your shots when you can drop back, and so I think it'll be probably a closer game. I don't know. I just can't. I'm too much of a pessimist to pick the Bengals to win this one. They could win for sure. And when you've got Burrow, I'm not too much of a pessimist to say, Burrow is legit and Burrow can win games for you that you shouldn't win. But I'm going to have to just stick with maybe as a reverse jinx. I still think the Titans will most likely win, but the Bengals could win. They could win the whole thing. They say this is their shot. They've been remarkably healthy until last week. They lost a couple of guys. Everybody's got injuries, but they've still been remarkably healthy. So you never know what could happen. I think it's been a fun ride. I have something I wrote and I didn't publish it yet, but it's basically like they're basically playing with house money at this point. Mm-hmm. Like, nobody has known what it's kind of been like for 30 years for them, because even what they had to worry about the streak, even if they were going into a playoff game, whether they should or shouldn't win it, they kind of had that on them. So they got that out of the way. Now, if they win this game, it's not like if they lose this game, you all of a sudden have all the same questions about that have been dogging them for 30 years. That stuff is answered. So you're not favored. You go in there, whatever happens, and then you're set up to get better. They've got a lot of cap space. The holes that they have are very fillable, even in one off season. So you have nothing to lose going into this game, and maybe that will serve them well because their weapons are legit. Their quarterback is legit. But it is just kind of hard. I felt like they would win last week, but it is just hard to just say, well, they're going to go on the road and beat the number one seed. But not that we haven't seen that happen, elsewhere in the NFL either. So we'll just keep our fingers crossed and try to have a good time on Saturday afternoon.
Yeah, you get to watch football this late in January. That's kind of a fun new experience for most Bengals fans under the age of about 30 or so. So definitely.
Yeah. Well, I always tell people
enjoy it.
When Montana to Taylor happened, I ran into my room crying and said I would never watch football again. And I was,
and you never did.
Yeah, and and guess what? I did in fact watch football again within several months. So it is kind of amazing to just see everything kind of come full circle on that, and they really do seem to be in this. They're in new era number 3, and this one I think is like legit, at least with the quarterback. Well, they may need to upgrade that coach, but we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. They've got a lot of pieces that are young and a lot of things to feel good about for now and the future.
Well, this went a little longer than we typically go on these morning shows, but there was a lot to talk about. I like talking to Marcus, so and you know what, you guys have a whole weekend to fill, so you can space this out throughout the weekend as you see fit. So, Marcus, thank you for joining me,
Thank you.
and thanks again to Marcus. Always like having him on. We've had him on a couple times before. He is we talk to him a lot while we're on trips. Spent a lot of time hanging out with him at the Rose Bowl, and he always has interesting thoughts on football and sports in general. So figured he would be a good person to talk about some of that playoff stuff. And yes, there is going to be a lot of playoff stuff to talk about. There will be a lot of Jim Harbaugh stuff to talk about, and I guess maybe there will be more Bengals stuff to talk about. We'll see how that goes later on today. But hope you guys enjoyed that show. You can find if you like that show and you have more stuff, more time to kill this weekend. You should check out some of our other great podcasts like Buckeye Weekly that Tony Gerdeman and I do, the Big Me Kickoff Show that Kevin Noon does, Gives in the Bank with Mark Givler and Bill the Bank Green, Around the Oval with Alex Gleitman. You can find all of those shows wherever you find this show. Just search Buckeye Scoop to find all of them. You can subscribe right there. Leave us a 5-star rating and review, which will help other folks find those shows as well. And if you prefer watching on YouTube, you can just go to youtube.com/Buckeye Scoop. All those shows are going to be posted there, as well as player and coach interviews, high school highlights, camp highlights, all sorts of new stuff. That's all at youtube.com/Buckeye Scoop. You can hit that bell to subscribe. That will get you notified every time we post a new show. And also hit that thumbs up button. That will help that magical YouTube algorithm spit this show out to new people so we can help grow our audience even faster. Thank you guys all for joining us. Have a great day. We'll talk to you tomorrow.